On my 72nd birthday, my son invited me on a cruise. I wanted to believe it meant he still loved me, that the 4 years of crushing silence between us had been a misunderstanding, a temporary frost that was finally beginning to thaw. But on the third night, as the ship cut through the ink-black Atlantic, a young waitress slipped a folded napkin under my dinner plate. The hastily scribbled words felt colder than the sea air. "Call for help. There is something in your tea." My hands went numb around my water glass. My own son. I tried to reason it away as a mistake, a cruel prank, but a part of me, the part that had learned to listen to the empty spaces in his phone calls long before they stopped altogether, knew it was the truth. So what do you do when the person you gave life to decides yours no longer has value? When the child you taught to read decides to write your final chapter? The invitation had arrived on the morning of my actual birthday. I'd found a small, plain envelope under my apartment door. No card, no familiar handwriting, just a sterile printed note. Pack for cool weather. The boat leaves from Portland Friday at 10 a.m. It was from Mark. The last time I had heard his voice was on a Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago. I'd called to tell him a signed first edition by his favorite childhood author had come into my bookstore. He was distracted, his replies monosyllabic. He'd ended the call by saying, "Mom, I'm in the middle of something," and never called back. Not for holidays, not for my birthday, not even when a bad fall on the ice landed me in the ER last winter with a fractured wrist. So when I saw that note, I didn't know whether to feel the radiant bloom of joy or the cold grip of dread. I sat at my kitchen table for a long while, the untouched coffee growing cold, staring at those impersonal words. Why now? The cynical part of me, the part sharpened by years of disappointment, whispered that no good could come of it, but the mother in me, a stubborn and foolishly hopeful creature, imagined he was finally ready to bridge the chasm between us. 2 days later, I stood on the pier in Portland, Maine, clutching a wool scarf my late husband, Richard, had given me. The cruise ship Mark booked was modest, not a floating city, but a local line that traced the rugged New England coast. It felt intimate, almost cozy, and there he was, my son, waiting at the end of the gangplank with that old, easy smile that used to light up a room. His wife, Simone, stood beside him, polished and poised as ever, in a cream-colored coat. She gave me a half-hug that felt more like an assessment, the kind you give to a distant relative you're obligated to greet. "Mom, you made it," Mark said, taking my small suitcase. "We were so hoping you'd come." The room they'd prepared for me was surprisingly lovely, a detail that both warmed and unsettled me. Soft, high thread count blankets, a small vase of my favorite freesias on the nightstand, and a framed photo of us from a long-ago summer at the lake, a time when my laughter was genuine and his smiles weren't a performance. On a small bookshelf were titles by authors I adored. It felt meticulously thought out, as if someone had studied a file on me, remembered every preference I'd ever mentioned. It was the careful curation of care, not the spontaneous act of it. That night at dinner, they sat on either side of me, a fortress of attentiveness. Simone poured me a cup of chamomile tea from a personal thermos before I could even reach for water. "I brought this from home," she said. "It's organic, helps with travel stress." Mark cut my salmon for me, his movements deliberate, as if I were a fragile doll who might shatter. It was sweet, but profoundly strange. I wasn't used to being tended to, and certainly not by them. They asked about my bookstore, a place Mark hadn't set foot in for nearly a decade. They inquired about the monthly poetry readings I still hosted and the literacy program I volunteered for. They were listening, or at least performing the part of listening with unnerving skill. Later, as I stood on my small balcony looking out over the dark, churning water, I allowed myself a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was his way of apologizing, a grand gesture to make up for years of neglect. But as I've learned from the pages of countless novels in my shop, the most compelling villains are often the most charming. Something inside me, a quiet, persistent instinct, stayed alert. And sometimes, it's the calmest moments that come right before the storm. The morning of the second day, I woke feeling oddly heavy. A strange lethargy settled deep in my bones. There was a tightness in my chest, and my hands tingled as I gripped the bathroom sink. I blamed it on the sea air, on the simple fact of being 72. At breakfast, Mark was absent, attending a work call, Simone explained. She greeted me with that same bright, unwavering smile, guiding me to a secluded table by the window. She handed me a steaming mug. "A special blend I picked up in Charleston," she said. "It's wonderful for circulation." It smelled faintly of mint and something earthy I couldn't place. I took a few polite sips. After just half a cup, my head felt cloudy. Not spinning, not quite dizzy, just fogged, as if my thoughts were moving through water. I blinked a few times to focus on Simone, who was talking about how cruises helped people reconnect. "You deserve this, Clara," she said, using my first name more than usual, a habit I'd always found slightly disrespectful. "You've given your whole life to others. It's time you were pampered." Her words landed soft, but they felt rehearsed, lines from a script I hadn't been given. She then steered the conversation to my health, asking about my medications, specifically the little blue pills for my blood pressure. I nodded slowly, pretending not to notice the way her eyes flicked toward her phone as she discreetly typed something under the table. Later that afternoon, the fatigue clung to me like wet wool. On the top deck, Mark handed me a glass of lemonade that tasted slightly off. Not bad, just not right. I set it down, saying I'd rather have water. Simone quickly produced a chilled bottle from her tote bag, twisting the cap for me before I could. Her helpfulness was suffocating. That night, dinner was in the captain's lounge. My appetite had vanished. When dessert came, Simone reached for a teapot the waiter had placed on our table. "A different blend," she said brightly. "Lavender and chamomile, for digestion." I let her pour it, watched her stir in a splash of honey, and slide the cup toward me with a practiced grace. Her eyes never left the cup. I brought it close, pretended to take a sip, then set it down. Her smile remained, but it didn't reach her eyes. Back in my room, the fogginess returned. Worse this time. My stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting pain. I lay down, breathing through it until it passed, but a low hum of unease remained. In the mirror, my face was pale. I noticed a distinct tremor in my right hand as I brushed a strand of hair from my face. I didn't remember shaking before this trip. That night, I barely slept. By sunrise, I knew something was deeply wrong, but I also knew I had to pretend it wasn't. Dinner on the third night was when the performance unraveled. The dining room was quieter. Simone and Mark arrived late. The waiter came around, and Simone insisted I try her ginger pear spritzer. I let her pour it, watching the liquid bubble before settling unnaturally flat. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment of clean, unscented air to clear the fog in my head. As I walked back, a young waitress stood near the service cart. Her name tag read Sophia. She was folding napkins, but her eyes, wide and worried, followed Simone. When I passed her, she looked directly at me, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. As I reached my chair, I found it. Tucked just beneath my folded dinner napkin was a small, torn piece of paper. The shaky words were written in pen. "Call 911. There is something in your tea." My throat tightened, the air catching in my lungs. For a moment, the ambient sounds of the dining room, the clinking of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, the distant piano, faded to a dull roar. I blinked and read it again, slower this time. The handwriting was rushed, the ink slightly smeared. I looked around calmly, my movements deliberately slow. No one was watching me. I slid the paper into my purse and placed the napkin on my lap as if nothing had happened. Beneath the table, my hands trembled, not from age, but from pure, cold fear. Liana asked if I was feeling cold. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. She smiled her predatory, solicitous smile and ordered me another tea. The moment the waiter set it down, I could smell it. Chamomile mixed with something slightly metallic and cloyingly sweet, like wilted flowers and copper. I thanked him and let it sit untouched, a porcelain cup of poison. In my cabin, I locked the door and pulled the note from my purse. Panic rose in my chest, hot and sharp. Someone had noticed. Someone had risked everything to warn me. That night, I didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door, a soft knock, then nothing. At breakfast, I saw Sophia again. As she poured coffee for the man beside me, she turned her wrist slightly, revealing a tiny mark in pen near her thumb. It was a phone number. Her eyes met mine, a fleeting glance of shared, terrifying knowledge. I wasn't imagining any of it. The next morning, I went to the mid-deck cafe. Sophia walked in, and as she cleared a nearby table, she leaned slightly in my direction, whispering. She was a pharmacology student, she said, and she'd seen my daughter-in-law adding something from a small brown bottle to my cup 2 nights in a row. She slipped another note under my saucer. Back in my room, I read the message, a single word, digoxin. A warning. It can mimic natural heart failure symptoms in older adults. And a suggestion, get your blood tested. The name of the drug was a key turning in a rusted lock. I remembered it from years ago when a member of my book club lost her grandson to an overdose of cardiac medication. It had been tragic, subtle, silent. The door clicked open behind me. It was Mark. He smiled too casually, asking if I was feeling okay. He said he and Simone had been looking into new care options for me, that maybe it was time to stop running the bookstore, a condo in Sarasota, quieter, easier. He told me not to worry, they'd handle the paperwork. I thanked him, said I'd think about it. When he left, I locked the door and slid a chair beneath the knob. I took out my notebook and began to write everything down. Now I knew the truth, but they didn't know I knew. And that gave me time. When I returned to my cabin that afternoon, another unmarked envelope was under the door. A burner phone. Room 212. Midnight. At 11:30 p.m., I slipped out. In room 212, Sophia handed me a manila envelope. Inside were 3 photos. The first showed Simone pouring something from a small brown bottle into a teacup. The second was of Mark outside a pharmacy. The third was a time-stamped shot of my cabin door. Sophia said a friend in security had helped. She believed I was in danger. She pressed a small voice recorder into my hand. "Just in case," she whispered, then disappeared. The next day, the ship docked at a small harbor town. Mark asked if I wanted to join them. I said I was tired. After he left, I found a service panel Sophia had described. Behind it was a locked cabinet with a prepaid phone and a note with a name and number for a lawyer. That afternoon, Simone came to my room. She said they felt it was time to start thinking long-term. She pulled out a manila envelope. "Just some drafts," she said. I told her I'd look at it later. That evening, I dressed carefully, the voice recorder in my pocket. At dinner, Mark greeted me with a pre-poured glass of wine. I accepted it and placed it on the tablecloth without drinking. I was finally watching back, and I had already started to record. The waiter set down a pot of tea, for me and only for me. I cupped the warm mug but didn't drink. Instead, I asked them about the envelope. Mark said it was just estate planning. Simone added that they wanted to give me peace. I smiled. Back in my cabin, I opened the envelope. Inside were transfer papers, power of attorney forms, and bank authorizations, granting Mark full control. Just after midnight, I met Sophia on the crew deck. She handed me a flash drive. Her friend had copied camera footage. Simone slipping something under my door, Mark handing a waiter a note, a blurry shot of the brown bottle in Simone's purse. There was no turning back now. The next morning, the ocean was calm. I dressed with care, a navy blouse to cover the recorder, slacks with deep pockets for the drive and photos. I went to the reception deck and asked to see the onboard legal liaison. A young officer named Givens led me to a private conference room. His demeanor was polite, formal, and just the right amount of skeptical. I laid out the flash drive, the photos, the notes, and the unsigned documents. I didn't dramatize. I explained plainly that I believed my son and daughter-in-law had been systematically drugging me to gain legal control of my estate. I did not cry. I did not shake. I simply told him the truth. His skepticism slowly melted into a quiet, focused concern as he reviewed the materials. He asked for permission to take the drive to the ship's security chief. I agreed. He also offered to send a private message to my attorney back home. After the meeting, I waited in the library. By lunchtime, Mark appeared, asking if I wanted to eat on the upper deck. At the table, Simone poured iced tea. Halfway through the meal, a crew member asked Mark and Simone to come with him, saying the captain requested a short conversation. Their smiles twitched. Mark touched my shoulder and said he'd be right back. I watched them go. Then I finished my tea, the one I poured myself. 30 minutes later, Officer Givens returned. He said the ship's medical officer had reviewed the footage. It wasn't conclusive, but it was suspicious enough. Mark and Simone were being questioned separately and had been asked to remain in their cabins until the next port. He asked if I wanted to press charges. Not yet, I told him. First, I needed to talk to my lawyer. That evening, I sat alone at dinner by choice. Sophia passed by once. Our eyes met, and she gave the slightest nod. Back in my room, I finally slept, deep and uninterrupted. The storm had broken, but I knew there was more to come. The next morning, the ship docked at its final port. I had already spoken to my attorney. The call was brief, but sharp. Mark had contacted her office 2 weeks earlier, requesting copies of my trust and power of attorney forms, saying I was slipping. He'd asked if the trust could be amended without my physical presence. At 10:30 a.m., I walked into the main lounge for the farewell reception. I had asked the captain for 15 minutes. The microphone felt light in my hand. I spoke about how a journey can remind us that people show their true nature when they think no one is watching. Then I called Sophia to the front. I smiled and handed her an envelope. Inside was a scholarship certificate, funded by a small foundation my late husband and I had supported for years. It covered her final year of tuition and living expenses. Her hands trembled as she hugged me. I watched Mark and Simone standing near the back wall, their faces unreadable. Later, I met with Officer Givens one last time. I gave him the recordings, the photos, and the flash drive, asking that a report be filed and forwarded to my attorney. That night, I slept in a small inn overlooking the water, just the quiet rhythm of my own breath, steady and mine. 3 weeks later, I sat in my attorney Janice's office. I had asked her to start fresh. Every document that named Mark or Simone was removed. My bookstore would pass into the hands of a community foundation. The house, my health care proxy, the charitable trust, all of it was now protected, their names erased as completely as they had tried to erase me. Janice offered to file a police report again. I told her no. I didn't want my life to become about chasing them. That wasn't my story anymore. One Thursday, a large official envelope arrived. It was from Mark and Simone's attorney. They intended to challenge the trust revisions, claiming undue influence, suggesting I had been coerced under stress. Janice laughed when I called her. "Don't worry," she said. "We have everything." Her response letter included the full cruise investigation report, complete with photographs, transcripts, and voice recordings. 3 weeks later, another envelope arrived. A withdrawal statement. They had dropped their claim. Resolved. That weekend, I hosted a small gathering at the bookstore. Sophia came. She brought me a small jar of loose-leaf tea. The tag said, "Safe." We sat in the back corner, sipping tea that tasted of comfort. The following autumn, the trees on my street turned a burnt orange. Life didn't return to how it was. It became clearer. I took down the family portrait above the fireplace and replaced it with a framed quote I copied myself. "I am not what was done to me. I am what I chose to do after." Maris wrote to me once a month. In one email, she told me she had changed her thesis topic. Now, she was researching the long-term metabolic impact of low-dose exposure to certain cardiac medications. She ended the note with a line that said, "I never pour tea for anyone without watching their eyes." I replied, "I'm proud of you." I meant it. I heard through a third party that Mark and Simone had moved to a smaller, quieter town. I wondered once if what they'd done had broken something permanent between them, but then I folded that thought up and let it go. I had no room left for imagining lives that chose to leave mine. By winter, the rhythm of my days felt settled. One evening, sitting by the window, I opened my notebook and wrote just one sentence. "You outlived the poison. Now live like you never drank it." The world didn't need to know everything I endured, but I needed to remember the woman I became, a woman who sat in a dining room full of smiling faces and chose, with a steady hand, not to drink. That choice saved more than my life. It returned me to myself.